Have you ever noticed that the strongest men, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, aren't those who experience the most pleasure, the most achievements, or the most stories to tell, but rather those who don't need these things to exist? It's almost counterintuitive, I know. From a young age, you were taught to believe that desire is power, that sexual validation is status, and that the absence of stimulation means failure. But what if I told you that this teaching is one of the biggest saboteurs of the modern male mind? Carl Jung already warned, the man who confuses impulse with identity becomes a slave to his own psyche. And that is precisely why so many live exhausted, insecure, overstimulated, trapped in a cycle that promises pleasure but delivers emptiness. The truth is brutal. No one masters their own destiny while being dominated by their own desires. But there is a small group, tiny indeed, that has discovered a completely different, almost forbidden path to desensualize the mind. And here's the point few dare to admit. When a man disconnects sex from his mind, he doesn't become less masculine. He becomes uncontrollable. He stops reacting like a conditioned animal and begins to decide like a strategist. He stops living to be desired and starts living to build. That's why this video exists, to show you the dark psychology behind this transformation and why it could be the most profound turning point in your life. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now, not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He always believed that what he desired was who he was. And this didn't happen by chance. From an early age, someone whispered in his ear, family, culture, media, friends, that his value lay in how much he was desired, followed, approved. As if the ego needed this constant fuel to avoid collapsing. This hijacking of identity is so profound that Carl Jung would say that his persona was trained to perform desire, not truth. And when the persona takes the wheel, the individual forgets that there is a self behind the costume. He begins to act as if spirituality were a stage, not a path, pushed by social archetypes that mold who he should be. And the most curious thing, he doesn't even realize it. He only feels this silent pressure to conform, to please, to impress. In shadow work, this appears as that discomfort of not knowing if the dream is his or just a reflection of the world. And when he tries to understand why he lives exhausted, he discovers it's not life that tires him. It's carrying an identity that was never his. And that opens the door to the next point. How they sold that idea so well. They sold him the absurd notion that desire checked identity and impulse checked purpose. As if wanting something automatically meant that it defined who he was. Jung would explain this as a confusion between the unconscious and essence. When a person doesn't differentiate a simple impulse from what truly sustains them, they become a puppet of their emotions. The persona, thirsty for approval, learns to mold itself to what receives the most applause, and then the individual thinks they are living when in reality they are reacting. And reactions don't build destiny, they only repeat patterns. As a mentor, he would understand that this happens to anyone who has never stopped to analyze the origin of their own desires. A practical tip I give here is simple. For 3 days, write down everything you feel like doing and ask yourself, did this come from me or did someone plant this in me? It's an exercise in practical spirituality, almost an ego detox. And it is in this questioning that the true narrative begins to crumble, revealing the insidious manipulation behind it. This implanted narrative is so efficient that it transforms man into a smiling slave to his own appetite. He thinks he is choosing, when in reality he is being led. He believes he is living intensely when he is only obeying conditioning. Jung would call this a man possessed by the archetype, a state where it is no longer the individual who acts, but the impulse disguised as need. And in shadow work, the central wound appears, the illusion that without desire he does not exist. This man chases after pleasures, like someone chasing after air, without realizing that each chase tightens another shackle. He doesn't realize that the more he seeks external stimuli, the more he loses internal depth. And it is precisely there that the inevitable question arises. What happens to someone who lives imprisoned in the pursuit of pleasure and sexual validation? The answer opens the next chapter of this journey. When a man enters the cycle of the relentless pursuit of pleasure and sexual validation, something silent happens within him. The ego becomes voracious. He begins to live as if each approval were oxygen and each rejection, suffocation. Carl Jung would say that in this state, the archetype of the lover takes control without balance, transforming a natural impulse into compulsion. Spirituality becomes distant, almost a luxury, because the mind is too busy counting invisible likes and collecting micro-approvals that evaporate in minutes. His persona learns to sell itself, seductive, available, desirable, even when the soul is begging for silence. And the more he molds himself to what others desire, the less he realizes that he is being molded by internal forces he doesn't understand. This imprisonment is not physical. It's psychological. He doesn't chase pleasure. He chases the feeling that he exists. And this opens a wound in the shadow work. Without validation, he feels he is nobody. Without the desire of others, he believes he has no value. The belief that without constant pleasure he is dead, and without sexual validation he is worthless, is perhaps one of the most destructive illusions of modern man. It's as if the entire meaning of existence resides in someone else's attention. At this point, the ego becomes so hypersensitive that any silence seems like rejection, and any pause seems like abandonment. It's almost comical, if it weren't tragic, to realize how a single glance can shatter all the self-confidence built up over years. Jung would call this symbolic dependence, when the subject transfers their power to the gaze of another. And spiritually, this disconnects them from their own center because vital energy begins to be drained outwards. They live to be chosen, remembered, validated. A simple example: if someone sees a message and doesn't respond, they already feel diminished. This is the kind of prison that doesn't use chains. It uses the reflection of the other as a shackle. And here we arrive at the central thesis that few dare to admit. A man trapped by desire is the easiest to control. A man with desire is controlled with promises. A man with need is controlled with crumbs. The world has learned this very well. The algorithm has learned this very well. And his persona, conditioned for years, remains faithful to the cycle like a devotee. Carl Jung would say that this man is identified with a fragmented image of himself, a self that only exists when observed. It's sad, but common. And spiritually speaking, whoever depends on another to feel powerful will never be truly strong. In shadow work, this is the point where many give up because nobody likes to admit they are being manipulated by their own appetite. But it is precisely in this recognition that the door to the next stage opens, the possibility of desensualizing the mind and transforming desire into strategic strength. When people talk about desensualizing the mind, many imagine repression, coldness, or denial of one's own nature. But what's really at stake is something much deeper: the ability to choose where your vital energy goes. Carl Jung would explain this as taking the ego off autopilot and putting consciousness in command. A man who learns to redirect his impulses doesn't become less masculine. He becomes less manipulable. It's almost like doing shadow work in slow motion, observing each impulse and asking, does this serve me or does it just drain me? The spirituality here isn't mystical, it's strategic. He understands that renouncing raw desire doesn't mean becoming a monk disconnected from the world, but transforming desire into an instrument of clarity. The persona ceases to be a slave to approval and begins to operate from a new archetype, that of the creator, the strategist, the one who uses energy instead of being used by it. And this opens up a mental space he never imagined existed before. The difference between renouncing desire and transforming it into a weapon is subtle yet powerful. Renouncing out of fear is escape. Transforming through awareness is power. The man who renounces because he fears desire becomes rigid, disconnected from his body and life. Jung would call this dangerous repression, which sooner or later explodes. But he who transforms desire understands that the energy born from attraction is the same energy capable of driving projects, building vision, and sustaining purpose. Spirituality teaches that energy is not lost, only converted. Desire without direction becomes distraction. Redirected desire becomes presence, focus, depth. A practical exercise. Every time you feel an impulse wanting to take control, stop for 10 seconds and direct your attention to something you want to build: study, training, writing. It seems simple, but it's the beginning of reclaiming the throne of your own mind. And that's where the persona begins to lose strength, giving way to a more conscious self. Desensualizing the mind means exactly that, exchanging external conquest for internal mastery. What was once compulsion becomes discernment. What was once need becomes choice. What was once impulsiveness becomes strategy. Carl Jung said that when a man integrates his inner forces, especially those he tries to hide, he becomes dangerous in a silent way. Not because he threatens, but because he doesn't need to. Spirituality describes this state as centering. Shadow work calls it individuation in progress. And in everyday life, this appears simply. He no longer reacts to provocations. He is not distracted by any glance. He doesn't waste energy trying to prove something. His presence changes without him making an effort. It's as if the ego understands that it no longer needs to beg for attention. And this change opens the way to seeing the root of the problem, the addiction to validation, and the consequent loss of self. When he finally looks at his own life honestly, he realizes how many decisions he made simply to avoid losing someone's approval. It's frightening. Courses chosen to impress, relationships maintained out of fear of rejection, opportunities refused to avoid disappointing. Carl Jung said that the ego, when fragile, leans on the external gaze like a child who needs to hold the adult's finger to avoid falling. Spirituality would call this disconnection from the center. And the persona, that social mask, learns to shine whenever there is an audience. He believes he is living intensely, but he is only avoiding criticism. A simple example. How many times has he posted something just to see who would react? Or how many clothes has he bought to feel he was up to par? Shadow work reveals that each of these gestures is a reminder that he was trained to be desired, not to be free. And realizing this hurts, but it opens a direct path to profound change. The validation cycle functions like an emotional labyrinth. It seeks attention, receives it, feels euphoria, and minutes later is empty again. Dopamine levels drop quickly, and the ego craves more. Carl Jung would say this happens because man is trying to fill an inner void with stimuli that weren't meant to last. Spirituality shows that what comes from the outside will never sustain what is broken inside. And the persona, desperate to maintain the image of someone desirable, becomes a marketer of its own existence. It's that feeling of always selling something, even when no one asked. A useful exercise here: spend an entire day without posting anything, without seeking approval, without sending messages to provoke responses. Observe the discomfort. This discomfort is the addiction screaming. And it is precisely in this silence that he begins to realize how far he has distanced himself from himself by trying to be seen by the world. This addiction to validation is ingenious because it disguises itself as self-esteem, success, and even masculinity. He thinks he's taking care of himself when he's actually competing for approval. He thinks he's improving his appearance when he's just trying to be desired to avoid the fear of being ignored. Jung called this ego inflation, when a man fills himself up on the outside because he's empty on the inside. It's a modern archetype, the warrior without a sword, shining on the outside and fragile on the inside. Spirituality reminds us that what shines too brightly usually tries to hide something. And in shadow work, this appears as the question that always haunts, who am I when no one is watching? When he finally faces this question, he discovers that this whole search for validation is just a symptom of something deeper, the confusion between personal value and perceived value. And it is this confusion that the next topic begins to dismantle. The most curious and also the most dangerous thing is that this addiction to validation rarely presents itself as an addiction. It presents itself as self-esteem, self-care, personal improvement, when in reality, it's just the hungry ego trying to appear big. Carl Jung said that when the ego tries to inflate its image, it always pays the price with its own authenticity. And that's exactly what happens here. The man starts training not because he loves his own body, but because he loves being observed. He buys clothes not because he likes them, but because he hopes someone will notice. He lives according to the persona he has built, like a character that needs to maintain its shine to continue existing. Spirituality looks at this and sees a disconnection, the inner light extinguished, replaced by external spotlights. And shadow work exposes this layer with precision. Everything he does for himself has a small hidden intention to be validated, desired, recognized. The man who lives to be desired builds a life that doesn't belong to him. A body molded to please, clothes bought to impress, debts taken on to sustain a lifestyle that never had anything to do with his essence. Carl Jung would call this identification with the persona, when the subject believes so much in his own mask that he forgets who is underneath it. And this is tragic because it creates a modern archetype, the performance masculine, always trying to appear strong but internally broken. Spirituality shows that true strength lies not in aesthetics, but in coherence. And if you want a practical exercise to see if you're trapped in this, just ask yourself, if no one could see me today, would I make the same choices? This question quickly dismantles illusions. It shows that much of what he calls confidence is, in fact, dependence on the reaction of others. This addiction, masked as self-love, is so seductive because it offers small doses of immediate power. He looks in the mirror, likes what he sees, and believes that this is freedom. But freedom doesn't depend on reflection. Jung would say that when a man links his identity to something external, beauty, validation, attention, he imprisons himself precisely in what he believes he controls. Spirituality affirms that everything that needs constant maintenance to exist is not essence, it's persona. And in shadow work, this appears as the great lie that many avoid facing. I don't do this because I love myself. I do it because I fear disappearing. It's hard to admit, but that's the only way he breaks the trap. The next natural step, after this profound realization, is to separate personal value from external validation, one of the most difficult and transformative psychological transitions he will face. The question that begins this chapter is simple yet devastating. If no one desired you, would you still feel you were worth anything? It's the kind of question that dismantles masks, exposes cracks, and forces the ego to look at its own reflection without filters. Carl Jung said that true value comes from the self, not the persona. In other words, personal worth doesn't depend on how much one is seen, admired, or desired, but on how well one remains true to who one really is. Spirituality reinforces this as an ancient truth. Nothing external sustains something that needs to be found within. But modern man, immersed in distorted archetypes of masculinity, has learned the opposite. He has learned to confuse being desired with being worthy. And this creates a fragile emotional foundation, like building identity on quicksand. A compliment lifts him up, a rejection knocks him down. And in shadow work, this is the point where he discovers that it was never the desire of others that strengthened him, but rather the absence of his own center. Separating personal value from external validation requires courage because it implies destroying the entire emotional architecture built up over the past few years. It's like dismantling a house while you're still living inside it. Jung said this process is called individuation, the moment when a person finally differentiates what is theirs from what belongs to the collective. Here, the ego screams, the persona tries to protect itself, and the internal archetypes clash. The needy lover, the insecure warrior, the silenced sage. Spirituality offers a path, returning inward, even if it hurts. A simple exercise. Write down 3 things you admire about yourself that don't depend on appearance or approval. If it's difficult, great. It's a sign that there's real work to be done, and this work opens space for the rebirth of a more solid, less reactive, more conscious identity. The metaphor of identity built on quicksand is not merely symbolic, it's real. As long as a person bases their worth on the opinions of others, each step they take sinks deeper. But when they decide to rebuild their own structure from within, something changes. They stop swaying with the wind and begin to effortlessly sustain their presence. Carl Jung said that this is the moment when the persona ceases to command and becomes merely a functional tool. In shadow work, this appears as the discovery that one was not born to be a reflection, but a source. And spirituality describes this as a return to the center, a state where there is no longer fear of disappointing because there is no longer a need to impress. From here, a new journey begins, the journey of transforming sexual energy into creation, purpose, and vision. This is what the next topic reveals in depth. When Freud introduced the idea of sublimation, many didn't grasp the grandeur of the concept. The same force that can destroy a man can also build his empire. Carl Jung, although disagreeing with Freud on several points, recognized the power of this energy, especially when integrated rather than repressed. Here, man realizes that desire is not the enemy. The enemy is being controlled by it. Spirituality sees this energy as a vital current, the inner fire that can both burn and illuminate. And in shadow work, this is one of the most challenging points, because it requires confronting how much energy was wasted on distractions, purposeless relationships, and empty validations. It's not about becoming cold, but about becoming selective. Imagine redirecting all the energy invested in seeking approval to studying, training, creating, building. It's almost unfair how much life changes when this happens. Sexual energy, when sublimated, transforms into vision. It's as if a man were crossing a tunnel and on the other side, discovering that he always had infinite fuel. He just spent it in the wrong places. Jung would say that this force, when integrated into the conscious ego, awakens dormant archetypes. The king, the magician, the creator. Spirituality describes this as the ascension of energy, the movement from the base to the top, from instinct to clarity. A practical example. Many men report absurd productivity when they enter periods of retention or transmutation. Not because the act itself is magical, but because, for the first time, the focus ceases to be immediate pleasure and becomes lasting construction. The persona loses ground and the true self gains territory. The man realizes that he can channel this impulse to train with discipline, study deeply, and undertake with courage. The energy is the same, it's the destiny that changes. And here lies the greatest revelation. The energy that drags men to the abyss is the same energy that builds legacies. The difference lies only in who is holding the reins, the ego or the conscience. Jung said that when man refuses to look inward, his instincts govern him. When he looks, he governs his instincts. And governing this energy is an art. Spirituality calls it transmutation. Freud called it sublimation. Shadow work calls it emotional maturity. Whatever the name, the result is the same. Man ceases to be driven by impulses and begins to govern his own destiny. He realizes that he no longer needs to compensate with superficial pleasures because he has found something greater to invest his energy in. And when this happens, a new phase begins. The phase of silence, of conscious emptiness, and of profound self-reconstruction. When a man finally stops running from his own emptiness, something extraordinary happens. The silence, once frightening, begins to reveal things that the rush of daily life never allowed him to see. Carl Jung said that what the ego fears to find in silence is precisely what can liberate it. Spirituality considers emptiness as the womb of rebirth, the point where everything dies so that something new can emerge. And in shadow work, this is the sacred ground where masks fall. He realizes that without the constant search for pleasure or validation, a huge space remains within himself. A space that has always existed, but was buried under noise. Sitting in this emptiness is almost a forced meditation, an inevitable encounter with forgotten parts, and it is at this point that he discovers something. The decentralized mind is dangerous, not because it is cold, but because it is free. And freedom, for those who live to control, is a threat. A mind that doesn't need is a mind that no one manipulates. Jung would say that this state is the beginning of individuation, when the ego ceases to be a slave to impulses and begins to serve the self. Spirituality sees this as realignment, a return to the natural axis of consciousness, and in practice, this silence gives man an almost disconcerting clarity. He begins to see patterns that previously seemed normal, people who drained his energy, environments that sapped his strength, habits that kept him small. When he stops seeking external desire, he begins to recognize his own. A simple example. Something that previously made him chase approval now only generates indifference. And this is not arrogance, it is emotional maturity. The persona weakens, the archetype of the sage grows, and man understands that rebuilding himself requires a step that few accept, contemplating the void without trying to fill it. Rebuilding oneself from one's own silence is an intimate, sometimes solitary, but profoundly transformative process. Jung stated that man finds himself when he faces what he fears, not when he avoids it. And it is in this state of stillness that he perceives something that changes everything. Not needing is the true form of power. The desensualized mind does not beg, does not demand, does not humiliate itself. It chooses. It walks calmly, speaks little, observes much, And it is this posture that begins to provoke reactions in the environment, because everything that does not depend on the other threatens those who live dependently. But this already opens the next chapter, the social impact, the rejection and discomfort that the new self awakens in others. When a man begins to free himself from the need for approval, those around him don't quite know how to react. This is because for years, his persona had a clear social function: to please, to reciprocate, to be available. When this dynamic changes, the environment feels it. Carl Jung said that all individuation awakens external resistance because the ego of others is bothered by seeing someone breaking the expectations of the collective. Spirituality sees this as a natural part of the journey. By leaving the frequency of neediness, he stops feeding bonds based on emotional dependence. And this scares many people. He starts to be called cold, arrogant, distant, when in reality, he is simply aligned with himself. It's important to remember, the people who benefited from his old version will always be the first to attack the new one. The beginning of this change is often accompanied by loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness that hurts, but the kind that reveals. Jung would call this phase the withdrawal of projection, when man finally stops seeking in others what he needs to find in himself. Spirituality understands this as a purification of bonds, a natural cleansing of relationships that existed out of necessity and not out of truth. And in shadow work, this appears as internal resistance. The ego misses the old validation, even knowing that it destroyed it. It discovers that many of its bonds were built on the archetype of the pleaser, and when this archetype falls, the relationships fall with it. But this fall is not failure, it's a filter. Only that which does not depend on the old version of itself to exist remains. Freedom, however desirable it may seem, comes at an emotional price. When one becomes free, one realizes that their independence disturbs those who live under control, activates insecurities in those who live by reflexes, and reveals truths that many would prefer not to see. Jung said that a free man forces others to confront their own prison, and this naturally generates resistance. But this resistance is a sign that he is on the right path. Spirituality teaches that all real expansion involves ruptures, and these ruptures are precisely what prepares the ground for the next internal battle, facing the true enemy, not society, but one's own emotional conditioning. Here, the man finally discovers something that changes everything. The true enemy was never society, nor culture, nor the people around him. It was the emotional conditioning he has carried since forever. Carl Jung said that the unconscious governs the life of those who refuse to see it. That is, as long as he doesn't understand where his impulses come from, he will continue to obey them like a loyal soldier. Spirituality interprets this conditioning as invisible shackles, automatic associations between pleasure and approval, between identity and external desire. The ego was trained to react. The persona was programmed to please, and the internal archetypes organized themselves around the need to be recognized. In shadow work, this revelation hurts because it dismantles the victim narrative and puts the responsibility back in his hands, exactly where the power has always been. The idea of reflection addiction perfectly summarizes this phenomenon. It's as if the person constantly needs external signals, glances, messages, likes, compliments, to confirm that they still exist. Jung would explain this as a dissociation between self and persona. When the subject relies so much on the reflection of others that they lose contact with their own center, spirituality sees this as a disconnection from essence, a constant escape from oneself. And in practice, the behavior is predictable. They open their cell phone for no reason, revisit old conversations looking for emotional crumbs, interpret silence as rejection. All this to escape encountering their own emptiness. A simple and powerful exercise. Spend 24 hours without seeking any kind of external response or reaction. Just observe. This emotional abstinence reveals the intensity of the dependence they never had the courage to admit. Emotional conditioning is cruel because it disguises itself as logic. It says, you are only valuable if someone says you are. You are only desirable if someone proves you are. You are only interesting if someone reacts to you. Jung would say that these phrases belong to the shadow, that part of us that repeats inherited beliefs without questioning. Spirituality affirms that all of this is illusion, but an illusion efficient enough to enslave entire lives. When he realizes he is addicted to reflex, a new consciousness awakens. He finally understands that it is not the absence of validation that destroys him, but the absence of his own identity. And it is this understanding that leads directly to the next stage, the birth of emotional autonomy. Emotional autonomy begins the moment a person realizes they can generate their own energy, that they no longer depend on praise, messages, validation, or invitations to feel alive. Carl Jung said that individuation requires this rupture, ceasing to seek outside what was born to be found within. Spirituality describes this as lighting one's own fire instead of begging for warmth. In shadow work, this autonomy appears when the ego finally accepts that it no longer needs to compete for attention. And this is the point where the persona begins to melt, because its function has always been to please. The free person says no without guilt, leaves without drama, sets boundaries without fear, and preserves themselves without needing to justify themselves. They realize that emotional slavery has always been linked to digital slavery. That compulsion to check notifications, to wait for answers, to measure one's own worth by screen activity. Digital slavery is an extension of emotional deprivation. The cell phone becomes a mirror, a showcase, and a thermometer of self-esteem. Jung would certainly call this modern projection. Man transfers his inner search to a device that returns only distorted reflections. Spirituality would warn, nothing that blinks will give you back your identity. And, in practice, this manifests itself like this. He opens his cell phone, even unintentionally, updates conversations to see if anyone remembers him, feels micro-frustrations when he doesn't receive the expected validation. It's a silent but powerful prison. A practical and transformative exercise. Choose an entire afternoon to put your cell phone on airplane mode and observe the discomfort that arises. This discomfort is not a lack of connection, it's withdrawal from addiction. And facing it is one of the first real steps towards emotional autonomy. When he finally crosses that boundary, he discovers something liberating. Not depending on the desires of others is strength, not coldness. The ego calms down because it stops begging. The persona loses relevance because it no longer needs to perform. The internal archetypes reorganize themselves. The warrior gains focus, the sage gains voice, the king gains posture. The man becomes whole. He realizes he can walk alone without feeling he is losing something. He can refuse what does not honor him without feeling guilty. He can choose relationships and environments that nourish his depth, not his neediness. And paradoxically, it is precisely when he ceases to need that everything begins to flow more naturally. This new energy opens the ground for the next stage, channeling this inner state to build something greater: focus, presence, and empire. When the mind stops being driven by impulses and validation, something rare emerges: sustained attention. And sustained attention, in the modern world, is practically a superpower. Carl Jung said that energy follows attention. Therefore, a man who controls where he looks controls what he builds. Spirituality sees this focus as an alignment between intention and action, when the external finally reflects the internal. It is here that he begins to redirect his desensualized energy towards creation, purpose, and depth. The ego stops seeking distraction and starts seeking fulfillment. The persona loses its role as performer, and the archetype of the builder comes to life. Suddenly, projects that previously seemed impossible begin to take shape. Daily study, physical discipline, business, skills. He realizes that what was lacking was never time. It was unwasted attention. The true empire a man builds begins in the mind, not in fantasy, but in the ability to hold his gaze fixed on something long enough to make it real. Jung would call this psychic integration, when previously scattered parts finally work together. Spirituality calls it channeling, the flow of creative energy directed toward a specific end. And in practice, this is simple. He exchanges hours spent chasing validation for hours dedicated to building something that endures. A clear example. Instead of scrolling through social media or seeking empty conversations, he invests in deep reading, skill development, and daily practice of something that strengthens him. If you want to start today, a practical action is to set aside a 90-minute block each day for a specific study or project. The progress in 30 days is almost shocking. The idea that the true superpower today is sustained attention, not chaotic intensity, perfectly summarizes this stage. Chaotic intensity is what dominates the man driven by desire, quick impulses, emotional outbursts, motivation that evaporates. Sustained attention, on the other hand, is the domain of the king archetype, the one who sees far ahead, decides calmly, and builds with purpose. The ego learns to quiet down, the persona stops competing, and shadow work reveals new layers of maturity. He begins to realize that discipline is not prison, it is freedom. It is not rigidity, it is structure. And it is this structure that paves the way for the next move, transforming from an emotional player into a true chess player of his own life, someone who doesn't react to the board, but projects it. When a man finally achieves focus and emotional autonomy, something rearranges itself internally. He ceases to be an emotional player and begins to see the whole picture. Carl Jung said that when the unconscious becomes conscious, man stops calling what he himself created destiny. Here, the ego stops reacting like a wounded animal and begins to respond like an architect. Spirituality describes this as an elevation of perspective, the ability to observe situations without being swallowed by them. In shadow work, this is the stage where man understands that each trigger reveals a pattern, each emotion reveals a blind spot, and each impulse reveals an old program. The persona, once so sensitive to the external gaze, becomes merely a social tool, and the self assumes the leading role. The world remains chaotic, but he does not. The chess player doesn't play for the immediate move. He plays for the future position. And this is the new way of operating for the man who has detached himself from validation. Jung would say that this behavior expresses the integration of the archetype of the sage with the archetype of the king, vision and action walking together. Spirituality calls this expanded consciousness, when man no longer identifies with fleeting thoughts, but with the clarity that observes them. In practice, this means that he stops falling into useless arguments, loses interest in proving something to those who don't matter, and becomes extremely selective with energy and attention. He understands that every emotional reaction is an invitation to chaos, and every conscious silence is a strategic move. This changes everything: relationships, choices, paths. With less need for applause, more precision emerges. With less dependence on opinion, more purpose arises. Carl Jung said that true strength appears when a person aligns themselves with their own center, not when they try to control the external world. And this alignment creates a rare posture: firmness without aggression, security without arrogance, calm without passivity. It's the kind of presence people feel even before they understand it. In shadow work, this represents the integration of the inner warrior with the inner sage, creating a being who acts with maturity and intensity in just the right measure. The persona disappears and gives way to authenticity. And this transformation paves the way for an inevitable conflict, the internal war between the old self and the new self, the topic of the next section. The inner war begins when a man realizes there are two voices within him: the conditioned voice, trained by the past, and the awakened voice, which emerges when he finally looks at himself honestly. Carl Jung said that no awakening happens without conflict. Consciousness is always born from the tension between opposites. Here the ego tries to convince him to return to old patterns, seeking validation, pursuing pleasures, keeping the persona intact. But something within him has already changed. Spirituality describes this phase as the necessary friction for the old identity to crack. In shadow work, this is the point where the man needs to confront his own resistance, his internal saboteurs, his fears, and all this requires courage. But it is also the first sign that the real awakening has begun, because the old self realizes it is losing ground. There's a moment in this journey that no one forgets, when he looks back and no longer recognizes who he was. Not out of shame, but out of clarity. Jung would say that this is the encounter between the ego and the self, when a man realizes that he has lived for years as a character and not as the protagonist. His persona, that carefully constructed mask designed to please, begins to feel heavy, artificial, uncomfortable. And at the same time, his true identity begins to emerge with a silent force. Spirituality describes this as rebirth, not a sudden change, but a process that corrodes illusions until only the essential remains. He realizes that he no longer needs to perform, explain, or convince. He only needs to be. This recognition is liberating, but also frightening, because it demands that he definitively abandon the old version of himself. And then comes the phrase that changes the entire logic of his life: he who does not need dominates. Carl Jung said that the truly free man is the one who does not depend on others to exist. This is the point where the ego quiets down, where the persona loses strength, and where the internal archetypes reorganize themselves around a new structure, more solid, more conscious, more stable. The man finally realizes that the price of freedom is high. He will lose people, habits, environments, and even old versions of himself. But the gains are incomparable: clarity, peace, inner sovereignty, depth, and presence. And it is here that the next step becomes inevitable, transforming all this internal transformation into concrete action, as we will see in the last topic of this journey. At this point in the journey, the man understands that a desensualized mind is not merely a spiritual, psychological, or emotional choice. It is a silent declaration of war against everything that has imprisoned him for years. Carl Jung said that individuation requires the courage to break with old conditioning, and that is exactly what begins here. Spirituality reinforces this. Whoever controls their own energy controls their own destiny. And now he knows that he no longer needs to beg for emotional crumbs, perform to be seen, or bow to the gaze of others. The ego learns that it is no longer the center of the universe. The persona realizes that it can no longer command the show, and the internal archetypes align for a new phase, more lucid, more strategic, more profound. Shadow work has prepared him for this, to assume radical responsibility for his own path. And the first step is simple: to choose not to return to the old version. Applying this knowledge doesn't require complexity, it requires decision. A daily, almost ritualistic decision. It can begin with writing in a notebook today, "He who does not need masters." This phrase, repeated consciously, reprograms the mind to operate from fullness, not lack. After that, simple practices amplify the effect. Periods of intentional silence, physical training as a way to channel energy, in-depth studies that nourish the archetype of the wise person, reading authors like Jung to further understand the psyche, presence exercises to calm the ego. Spirituality suggests short meditations, 5 to 10 minutes, focused on the center of the chest, the point where the self manifests. Small daily actions build great identities, and each aligned choice reinforces the new version that is being born. And then the journey closes in on itself. He returns to the world changed, no longer as someone seeking desire, but as someone who creates direction. He understands that the goal is not to be admired, but to be whole. Not to collect glances, but to sustain presence. Not to flee from emptiness, but to transform emptiness into strength. Jung would say that, from here on, man becomes responsible for his own destiny. And that is more powerful than any external validation. The next step is simple. Turn this video into a milestone. Write in the comments, "He who doesn't need to dominates." Subscribe. Come back to continue awakening. Allow this message to resonate within him as an internal watershed moment. Because now, finally, he is ready to walk as a man who knows himself, and not as a shadow of what they expected him to be. Ultimately, it all comes down to a simple question, but one that few dare to face. Do you want to continue living as someone who reacts to the world, or as someone who designs their own destiny? Because this entire journey you've taken here isn't pretty theory or distant philosophy. It's daily practice, it's identity, it's a decision. And now you know, as long as the ego begs for desire, you will remain weak where you most need to be strong. As long as the persona pleads for validation, you will remain small where you were born to be a giant. The truth, the one no one says aloud, is that strong men aren't born strong. They build themselves in silence, through invisible choices, through discipline that no one applauds. They disconnect sex from their minds because they've discovered that the energy that once imprisoned them can build empires. And now that you've seen all this from the inside, the inevitable question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you revert to your old self? Or will you start rewriting your story today? I want you to answer in the comments, what part of this journey tore you apart inside? What will you change from now on? Do you still feel the need for validation from others? Or are you ready to let it die? If this resonated with you, if something awakened within your shadow self, then subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue walking with me. Each video here is a step in your individuation. And believe me, you have no idea of the strength that exists in the person who finally learns not to need.